We are here today to represent the Army remount depots, and they were the organisations that trained and produced horses for the British Army in the First World War. The fort here at Tilbury was actually the Belgian Army remount depot. The Belgian Army was in exile for quite a part of the war, and around this fort they used horses for the Belgian Army, and they trained them up and then moved them back to Belgium for use with them.
How specialised was this work?
Well, it's quite specialised. You had to know a lot about horses. Men that were slightly older perhaps and weren't quite suitable for frontline action were preferred. You had to have a bit of experience with animals beforehand, but then it wasn't unknown to have people completely novice to the horses, but they would be given more menial tasks to do, like mucking out and stabling, but the training would be left to experienced horsemen and women as well. A couple of the depots around the country used female riders to train and break and train horses.
It sounds a bit of a complicated name, Army Remount Department. What did it actually do?
Well, basically, from October of 1914, horses were coming in from North America and all around the world. About 6,000 animals came in from South America, about 6,000 came in from Spain and Portugal, and the rest overwhelmingly came from North America, mainly America, but also some from Canada. We also had about 50,000 come in from Australia, but most of those went straight to the Australian Army. Once they came in off the ships at Avonmouth and Liverpool, some into Southampton, some into Plymouth, but mostly the west coast ports of Britain, they would be sent to farms to recuperate, because some of these horses have been, and mules have been travelling for maybe 3 or 4 weeks from the Midwest of America. Once they got off the farms and sent to the remount depots, then they'd be assessed for what work they were suitable to do. So it was basically horses for courses. The bigger horses would have been put into draft, which means pulling carts and wagons and so on. The smaller animals would have been ascertained to be either cavalry horses or transport horses. Now, there was only ever about 67,000, nearly 80,000 horses for the cavalry, but there were well over 200,000 horses that were considered riding horses. So basically, you needed the equine equivalent of a motorcycle. So if you needed to get around but you weren't in the cavalry, you could be given a horse. People like chaplains, medical officers, dispatch riders, you necessarily weren't in the cavalry, but they were required to ride around. So you did that. The mules, again, they were trained up to take the packs and the saddles and pull in carts. So and again, depending on the size of the animal. So the bigger the mule, the bigger mules were put into draft, pulling wagons, and the smaller ones would be put into pack and used to carry the cargo on their backs. So that's what they did at the remount depots. And then once they were done with that, they'd all be sent off to France or Belgium and then handed over to the various units.
We're talking as the war grinds on, there's as many four-footed animals as two-footed human beings.
Well, yeah, I mean, you've got these numbers here behind me. The numbers killed in the First World War is 529,000, thereabouts. At the start of the war, you had 27,500 animals in the British Army. By the end of the war, October 1918, you've got nearly 900,000 horses and mules. So that's a vast increase in livestock. So you've got to do that. So, but the mortality rate, as you see on this card here, is about 14%. So the death rate was fairly comparable to that of a soldier on average throughout the war. Sometimes a bit less, sometimes a bit more, depending on the time of year and also what was going on battle-wise.
What was the RSPCA and other organisations, animal welfare, doing when all these horses were, innocently losing their lives?
The RSPCA were operational on the Western Front, as was the Blue Cross. These were two organisations which were civilian organisations which sent out veterinary officers or veterinary personnel. So they did have a role to play. There was also an American version called the Red Star organisation, and they're still operational. So all three organisations, Blue Cross, RSPCA and the Red Star, are still animal charities now, but they did send out people to help look after the animals.
They tried to give them as much welfare as possible, but they couldn't avoid taking a bomb.
No, well, those guys specifically were behind the lines quite a way in base hospitals, but the personnel of the Army Veterinary Corps, they were quite close, and there are a couple of hundred casualties in the Army Veterinary Corps throughout the First World War. I think it's well over 1,000 of the Army Veterinary Corps personnel. You could get up, quite close and personal, with them.
Of course, Warhorse has put it on the map, hasn't it? The movie production, the stage production. Has that been true? Have you watched it? Is it a good representation of Warhorse?
Warhorse, the book, is a very nice children's story. The production values on Warhorse the play are excellent. I'd rather not pass comment on Warhorse the movie.
Really? Okay.
Yes.
A little comment on it? Is it that?
I think my mother told me never to say, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all.
Fair enough. Well, that's a controversy for you. Now, tell me about your situation. You're dressed up as who and what?
I am dressed today. I'm an Indian Army remount officer. My role, that's what I do to tell the story of the true story of the animals. So I would have been. I'm working with the Indian Army, as I say. The Indian Cavalry Brigade came over in early 1914, and they stayed. The Indian Cavalry stayed. The rest of the Indian Army went back to Mesopotamia and the Middle East, but the Indian Cavalry divisions, brigades, stayed throughout the war. So
did they do much charging? Sure.
Yes. Yeah.
Really?
Yep. There were several cavalry charges throughout. Every single battle, you've got to remember, every single battle in the First World War was designed and planned with the idea of breaking through the German lines and sending the cavalry through that break in the gap in the line and riding up the rear, left or right, of the Germans. So every single battle that you can think of, let's take for example the Somme battlefield in July 1916, there were tens of thousands of horses, cavalrymen, waiting and prepared and prepped and ready to go behind the front lines. Just a few miles, a place called Bray-sur-Somme. There were thousands of them, all lined up along the Somme.
In fact, the public perception that all these cavalry horses and charges after a couple of goes were faded out is not actually true.
No. Every single, like I said, every single battle was designed with the cavalry to take the ultimate action. So unfortunately, it didn't turn out that way because they just became bogged down every time. The trouble being was they couldn't move the guns forward fast enough a lot of the time, because without artillery support, the Germans would then counterattack. But all these horses were behind the lines, and you've got to remember, like I say, somewhere between 67 and 80,000 horses in the cavalry, but well over 200,000 horses in the transport lines. So all these animals, the majority of them actually, their life was spent moving stuff around rather than the chivalric charging into battle valiantly. But those that were in the cavalry did get used. There's a famous battle, again going back to the Somme, 2 or 3 weeks in, after the start of the battle, 1st of July 1916, the Indian cavalry went into a place called Highwood, and they actually took Highwood. The fact was they took Highwood, but they didn't get enough support from everybody else to hold Highwood. So it was a futile attack, but it was successful initially because the cavalry. It wasn't the cavalry's fault. It was the fact that the support didn't transpire afterwards. But the Indian Brigade took what they were required to do, and later some of the Canadian cavalry, they did sterling work. Most of the cavalry on the Western Front, well, all of them were expected to make their turn in the line, so they did trench duties as well. But also, they did escort duties for prisoners of war. They did patrol work, and of course, in the April battles of 1918, with the German offensive, the spring offensive of 1918, they were also highly operational, as was the cavalry in going back the other way, working towards the ultimate November of 1918. So, the latter part of the war, they were highly mobile and highly effective, because it was more of a mobile warfare from April of 1918 onwards.
The trenches had all been
Well, they were still being used, but I mean, there was a lot of backward and forward. There was more movement in 1918 than there had been for the previous 4 years. So you know, it was to be expected. And of course, once the German line did break and we were heading back, you've got to remember, say August of 1914, the British cavalry were at Mons, and it was the Australian cavalry, or the Australian light horse, and the rest of the cavalry were at Mons in 1918 when Mons was recaptured. So you know, the cavalry were there at the first and the cavalry were there at the last, and you've got to remember that the first and last casualties of the British Army were in fact horsemen, cavalrymen. Yeah, so they're both buried in the same cemetery at Mons.
Many VCs amongst the cavalrymen?
Quite a few, but again, so going back to the story about the transport, a lot of transport heroes as well, and a lot of unsung heroes. You know, the duties that we were performing were just as dangerous, just as sterling, but maybe not so glamorous. So I think when you're talking about VCs, it's a bit of a dangerous thing. If you were lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time and get noticed, you might get a VC. But a lot of people went unnoticed and unsung and unrecorded, but were still as brave. So I'm not a great fan of commemorating VCs because there was a huge element of luck if you were or weren't given. I think the guys that didn't get VCs are just as important as the guys that did.
So what's your idea of this reenactment that you do? Tell us a bit about the reenactment that you're here, you're dressed up. What gave you the idea to do all this?
Sorry, I don't generally call it reenactment. Has got this sort of idea that it's bangs and guns and cannons going off. I prefer to call it equine historical interpretation. It's a bit pompous, but there you go. It's about the story of the horses and the men and women that served with the horses. I think it's more important. We don't glamorise it. We tell the true story, going back to the Warhorse thing. The real story of what happened with the horses and the men and the women is actually more interesting than the fictional side. So I think that's an important thing. The animals that went off weren't volunteers. They were all conscripted. They had no choice in the matter. So I mean, that's an important part of the story that should be told. They did come back. I mean, that's the other fallacy that goes on a lot of the time. You know, I had a gentleman here today saying, "Oh, they were all shot and eaten." Well, no, they weren't. I get it. After 20 odd years of doing this, you get the same sort of like people coming up to you and say, "Oh, they took all the farm horses." Well, they didn't take all the farm horses because in August and September of 1914, you had a harvest to bring in. So most of the horses that went didn't come from farms. The horses came from companies like Pickford's and Tillings. Pickford's a removal company of today. They had large numbers of horses for moving furniture that needed moving about. The railway companies provided vast numbers of horses. Everything that went onto the railway system had to be got to the railhead, so the railways had huge fleets of horses. London Omnibus Company still had horses, not as many as they had before at the turn of the century, but still quite a large number. So you had horses from the cities more likely to go into the army rather than the countryside. Also, you know, they took my granny's pony. No, they didn't. Anything under 15 hands wouldn't have been required by the army. They took the pit ponies. No, how do you get the coal out of the ground and make steel for the armaments industry if you haven't got pit ponies? So they didn't go. They just took the animals without paying. No, they didn't. They all got paid a good market value rate for the animals. So you get that. And then at the end of the war, when people talk about the end of the war, I regularly hear people say, they just, they sold them all off or gave them away and shot them and ate them. That's not the story. The simple fact is they got assessed. Each animal got assessed. The fit ones were kept. The fit young ones were kept by the army. The less fit ones and the middle-aged ones were given away or sold for French farmers and the French and Belgian authorities to rebuild. I mean, the whole town of Ypres was rebuilt on the backs of horses, British Army horses and mules. And then, say, only the last ones, the old guys and the infirm and the sick and the ones coming to the end of their natural working life, they were shot, they were eaten, because in 1918 there was a European-wide food shortage. So, obviously, a horse is a food commodity.
But they weren't disguised as beef.
No, they weren't disguised as beef. They were, because there is a tradition in Europe of eating horse meat. In England, because of a religious edict from the Archbishop of Canterbury, if I remember rightly, horse meat wasn't, for quite a long time, horse meat was actually forbidden to be used as a meat in England. That's why we don't have such a tradition to eat meat, horse meat.